200 years ago, this past summer, in the cold, wet June of the year without a summer, a young woman began to write a story on a dare from friends to compose the scariest thing that she could imagine. 18 years old, she was holed up in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva, probably about 300 kilometers from here or so, with these friends, awed by the lightning storms echoing off the Alps, fueled by the ash from the eruption of Mount Tambora the previous year, probably doing laudanum and spending intimate time with a man who was married to another woman. Oh, I forgot that. Drat. There I was, launched into my narrative already. So what is that? That's in front of the train station in Milan, and I imagine that's the city of Milan and an apple helping us celebrate Frankenstein bicentennial. But beyond that, I don't really know. Now to the narrative. Fueled by the ash, there we go, from the eruption of Mount Tambora the previous year, probably doing laudanum and spending intimate time with a man married to another woman. That young woman, of course, was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. The married man was her still-to-be husband, Percy B. Shelley, and the others were, of course, Lord Byron, Byron's friend and doctor, John Polidori, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. And the story Mary wrote, from the scariest thing that she could imagine, was, of course, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, a story about a young science student named Victor Frankenstein who delves into the secrets of alchemical texts and discovers how to revivify a body composed of various pieces of other previously dead bodies, with disastrous consequences for him and his loved ones to follow. In writing Frankenstein, Mary produced the tropes of the mad scientist and the creature or the creation out of control, a myth for the modern age that continues to influence, after 2 centuries, the way we think about science and technology. And it's not just influencing the way that people who have read the novel or people who have seen the 1931 film or any of the perhaps 250 films derived from Frankenstein at any particular time. The mythic status really means that it has intruded upon our thoughts about science and technology in the language that we use. We talk about Frankenfoods even if we've never seen the film or read the novel. It really is omnipresent in the way that that even 200 years later, we think about science and technology. And so to think about how to explore and extend considerations about the societal aspects of science and technology, to think about a core theme in the governance of science and technology and a core theme in Frankenstein, this relationship that I want to call one between creativity and responsibility, there really is no better vehicle than this 200-year-old myth. And what I want to sort of emphasize is, this myth that has this interesting, through that little opening narrative, it has this interesting origin with this group of people, but as many of the literary critics who have approached Frankenstein have pointed out, that it perhaps could not have been written but for the person of Mary Shelley. And that's something that's really interesting. And one of the ways that I'm trying to translate this into contemporary life is thinking about Mary. Okay, she's 18 years old when she embarks on this, like I said. She's having this affair with Percy. She's traveling around Europe. She's doing drugs. In contemporary university parlance, Mary would be what we'd call an at-risk freshman, and she would be targeted for intervention by the university to make sure she stayed in school and stayed straight. Okay, that's who this young woman was. And it's sort of very strange that this power comes out of the experience that she was having, and how distant from what we think achievement is in the contemporary world of young women in particular. So to explore these issues of creativity and responsibility, like I said, I think there's no better vehicle than Frankenstein, because it takes you just about anywhere you want to go. And thus, starting in 2012 or so, colleagues and I began work on the Frankenstein Bicentennial Project. And what I want to do is give you a little tour of the activities to date of the Frankenstein Bicentennial Project, and then use Frankenstein and some other mythic sources to do a slightly deeper dive into a contemporary topic of synthetic biology. So we officially launched the project in the spring of 2013 on the occasion of a visit to ASU by Donna Haraway, author of Cyborg Manifesto, so that was a kind of appropriate beginning for talking about Frankenstein. And Donna was the guest of a group at ASU called the Institute for Humanities Research. And of course, part of the motivation for working with Frankenstein, not just because this interesting relationship of creativity and responsibility is at the core of the novel, but part of the motivation is to do cross-disciplinary work in a way that we at ASU think we have a very good handle on, and working with the Institute for Humanities Research was one of the ways of doing this. Then in the spring of 2014, we held a workshop sponsored by the U.S. National Science Foundation. This was a performance piece that was done during the cocktail hour of the workshop by a faculty member, Brian Foley. Well, he's now a faculty member. And what the workshop basically did was gathered some folks from ASU, gathered some folks from the outside world, broke up into some working groups, and developed agendas in various areas for different kinds of projects that could be hosted under the banner of the Frankenstein Bicentennial Project. And Year Without a Winter is one such project. Some of these are projects that we are engaged in. Some of them are ones that have not yet gained traction or gained personnel to work on. But there's a workshop report that can be circulated, and if this is really an open invitation, given still the time we have left in 2016, 2017, and 2018, for anyone who might want to join the overall project. And this, by the way, is just one kind of Frankenstein that Brian Foley does at our ASU's recent homecoming events. He also does a much more family-friendly Frankenstein, where he's in green face with neck bolts and on stilts, and takes pictures and hugs people and things like that. In the early spring of 2015, recognizing that the way that most people will have experienced Frankenstein is through film, we collaborated with the Seattle International Film Festival and hosted a panel and several talks, as well as 2 nights of film in, I guess it was February of 2015. And the films, and you'll see some stills from several of these later, range from the very first Frankenstein film adaptation, which was done by Thomas Edison's film company in 1910, a silent short that displays some of the real technical prowess that filmmakers were able to marshal even in 1910, to the 1931 Universal Studios, the famous Frankenstein film that basically carried Universal Studios through the Great Depression along with Dracula, to some of the Hammer films and the more B-style films that were made in the 50s, up through Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and culminating, well, not actually culminating, there have been several made since then, but the film festival culminated chronologically with Tim Burton's Frankenweenie, which is very important actually in the Frankenstein oeuvre, and I'll get to that. The centerpiece of the activities that we're engaged in right now is what we call the Transmedia Museum Project, and this is courtesy of a large grant by the U.S. National Science Foundation. And as illustrated here in the graphic, it comprises three parts. One is a digital online museum, and basically the idea is that we can try to build public competencies in science and society questions by inviting people in, not just to talk about things as we might do, say, in a consensus conference or in a participatory technology assessment, but to actually have them manipulate things, to build things, to create things, to join things, to collaborate with other people in making things. And so that's done in the digital environment in a digital museum of Frankenstein. And then we also have illustrated in the blue box on the right what we call our Frankenstein's footlocker, which is a set of kits that we will distribute to collaborating science museums and science centers in the United States, and then a set of making activities that will basically be digital instructions, not just for the things in the footlocker, but for a host of other kinds of making activities, say, how to pick your garbage and make a monster out of what's in your garbage, and then talk about what the properties of the monster might be, and whether you have responsibilities to what it is that other people have thrown away. What we've done in terms of the footlockers so far to date is designed and tested a couple of these sort of tabletop manipulable kinds of activities. On the bottom you can see something that we call Scribblebot, and it's made from a 6-inch section of foam rubber, foam noodle that's a sort of pool float. And you put an electric toothbrush down the middle of it, and you attach with rubber bands 3 magic markers, turn on the electric toothbrush, and it goes da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it draws. And you can have the beginnings of conversations through the Scribblebot with children as young as 8 years old about things like, well, is your Scribblebot alive? Why do you think so, or why not? Is what your Scribblebot drew on that piece of paper art? Why or why not? If someone wanted to pay for that piece of scribble, who would they pay, you or the Scribblebot? If your Scribblebot turned itself on and drew on something that otherwise was valuable and destroyed it, who would be responsible for it, you or your Scribblebot? Okay, so these are questions that cut to the very core of things that Mary was talking about, and conversations that Scribblebot can allow you to have with children as young as 8 years old. Similarly, in the upper left, what the kids there are doing is reassembling pieces of stuffed animals that we've cut up and sewed together and Velcroed, and so you can put, legs from your stuffed giraffe on bodies from your stuffed Elmo and heads of some other thing. And again, asking questions about, would this be appropriate to do with living animals? Would you want parts of one kind of animal put into or attached to other kinds of animals? Why or why not? What are the secret magical powers of the creature that you've created, that it has body parts from this animal and another animal? Is it like a chimera from Greek myth that has the powers of all the animals that bring it together combined? And one thing that's really interesting that we found out doing the testing of this is that if you put you can assemble the animals in any way that you want to, and for some reason they still end up being somewhat attractive, somewhat cute and cuddly. The one exception to this is that if you put a human head, a baby head, on one of these animals, and then you end up in that uncanny valley, and it's very disconcerting to lots of people who are making these things, and even sometimes to the folks who are supervising, to see that baby head on your otherwise recomposed stuffed animal. So that's something to explore a little bit. This past June, on the 2 days prior to the precise bicentennial of Mary's conception of Frankenstein, we held a workshop on bioethics and policy on the shores of Lake Geneva at the Brochet Foundation. And in addition to the discussions there, we released a little video. You can see that's me in the video and outside of the screen is my colleague Ed Finn from ASU's Center of Science and the Imagination, dressed as the creature, and he's pursuing me across this field, and in the background in the field you can see the Villa Diodati, where Mary and her friends were. And so we shot this little film with the Villa Diodati as a background to advertise our own dares around the Frankenstein Bicentennial Project, a short fiction writing dare that happened this past summer, and a creative nonfiction writing dare that is still ongoing with our ASU colleague Lee Goodkin, who is the editor of Creative Nonfiction Journal. Just this past fall, we've created a small exhibition at ASU's library about the general story of Frankenstein. Among the fun things you can see in the far right of that image, the thing that looks like a very bad Jackson Pollock in deep dark colors on the right-hand side is actually a large canvas produced by a Roomba, one of those little vacuum cleaner robots that zips around your living room, but instead of sucking up, it was spitting out paint onto that canvas. And this is something that the pattern of this kind of thing is something that is easily distributable. The library at ASU drew on its own library resources to put together the bulk of the exhibition, and the text was written by a collaboration of folks around the university. One of the other main pillars of the work is a new edition of the novel that my colleagues Ed Finn, Jason Robert, and I are producing with MIT Press that will be available later this spring. And it seems to be the first edition that is intended for an audience of scientists, engineers, and other creators. As you can see from the subtitle, it's targeted for STEM students, high school to grad school. And previously, the critical editions of Frankenstein that have been done have been mostly with a literary or historical interest, and this is really the first about its scientific interest, dedicated toward cultivating the ability of young scientists and engineers to think about the societal aspects, to think about this relationship between creativity and responsibility as they're learning their craft in science and engineering. And one of the things, again, like I mentioned earlier, that we're trying to emphasize to these students is their proximity to people like Mary and Victor Frankenstein. Because again, Mary was 18 years old when she embarked on this. Victor was a college student, not the sort of more mature doctor that you imagine from the films. And it's really, this is who they are. These are people who are grappling with the way they're trying to fit in the world, grappling with the ideas that they have and making their mark, trying to understand what it is that they're going to create as writers, as scholars, as scientists and engineers. And we wanted to give them the experience of reading this text, in essence, through Mary and Mary's and Victor's experiences. And of course, the creature himself is a child, is still learning. And that's perhaps the central quality of the creature, is the learning that goes on, both for good and for ill, about what the creature learns about the world around him. And so the book has an introductory essay by us, the editors. It has an introductory essay by the Frankenstein scholar Charlie Robinson, emeritus at University of Delaware. It has a set of 7 essays appended to the end by a variety of science fiction writers and STS scholars, and it has questions for discussion that can be used in the classroom, and so we imagine a classroom audience for this. And then penultimately, in the spring of 2017, ASU has a large art science festival that we call Emerge that began 5 or 6 years ago, and Cynthia was one of the founding creatives behind the concept of Emerge, and basically the idea is to use art science collaborations to open up possibilities, new possibilities of looking at futures in different ways, and Frankenstein will be the theme of Emerge in February of 2017, and then, as we'll be hearing more, there's A Year Without a Winter. So I want to say two more things and then get into this little case about synthetic biology. One is that you've heard that a couple of the activities, the original workshop and the large transmedia activity, were funded by the National Science Foundation, and then that we have this new edition of the novel coming out that's targeted at scientists and engineers. In popular imagination, and perhaps more importantly in scientific imagination, Frankenstein can often be seen as an anti-scientific screed, carrying messages that scientists should not transgress moral boundaries, religious boundaries, and scientists, needless to say, might take that as some hostility toward their enterprise. And this was, in fact, raised by the National Science Foundation to us, and not to talk too much out of school, but we were encouraged by the National Science Foundation to downplay the role of Frankenstein and the bicentennial itself, and to play up aspects of learning and creativity and responsibility and so on, in part because of this sensitivity. But part of the rebuttal to that position is, first, that Mary was, in fact, well-read and well-understanding of the science in her contemporary world. She had read many of the leading scientists of her day, including Humphrey Davy. There's a new wonderful biography out about Humphrey Davy, by the way, that uses some of Mary's text to explore how it is that this guy, Humphrey Davy, who was really a tremendous scientist, he was Faraday's tutor, he discovered 4 or 5, maybe 6 new elements, and was a major conduit for all of learning about chemistry and the beginnings of electrochemistry globally. And so he moved work from the New World, like Benjamin Franklin's work, into the Old World as well. And this new book uses some of Mary's language, talking about what it is that Victor is doing and talking about his technical ambitions, to describe how Humphrey Davy managed a career in science even before the term scientist had been coined. Okay, so what does a scientific life look like before there were scientists? And that's what this biography was exploring, and this biography draws on Mary's own understanding of what a scientific life was like, because she was in this reflective moment with people like Humphrey Davy. This is just a fun illustration that was published in Scientific American a number of years ago that connects Benjamin Franklin and his electrical experiment with the kite and the lightning bolt through Galvani to the demonstration of the effects of electrical impulses on even dead bodies that Aldini had been doing in public, to Mary's thinking. And not only had Mary been reading this stuff like Humphrey Davy, but she had in fact seen public demonstrations of galvanism done by Aldini and his colleagues. And what that meant was things like the corpse of dogs were set up on daises perhaps a little shorter and taller than this. And they were shocked, and people oohed and awed and sometimes fainted at the spasms that were created in the bodies of these animals that were shocked, not unlike the original, frog-leg experiments. And that's down in the lower right is the original galvanic pile that's on display at the Science Museum in London. What was also happening at the time, although there's no record of Mary having seen it, was that at least one human corpse was shocked in this way. And it was the corpse of a recently executed criminal, and the text about what happened is, rather gruesome. But people were doing this as public demonstrations. So imagine, okay, we're thinking about art and science and public engagement and so on. This is what they were doing at the time to popularize the latest scientific findings. Second is that science fiction, however seemingly anti-science, can be used for inspiring scientific creativity. The general point is made by authors such as Rosalind Byrne in her book Nanotalk, that was published in 2005, where she interviewed 36 nanoscientists about what they were doing in nanotechnology and where they found inspiration. And almost to a person, they referred to science fiction as something that encouraged their usually youthful interest in science and technology. Can anybody figure out what's going on in these photos? Does anybody know this person or what the equipment is on the right? Any guesses? So this is Earl Bakken, and Earl Bakken is the inventor of the transistorized pacemaker. And that's what you see on the lower right. On the upper right is a pre-Earl Bakken pacemaker, portable only in name, because you could put it on a wheeled table, but filled with vacuum tubes and so on. And so what's interesting about Earl Bakken, not only did he make this much smaller device that you see in front of a boy in the lower right, it's more or less, the first one that he made is more or less the size of a large human hand. Earl was the prototypical garage inventor. He and his brother designed the transistorized pacemaker in their garage in the early 1950s, and from that came the Fortune 500 company Medtronic. And from that came this wonderful little museum dedicated to the history of electricity and magnetism in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Bakken Museum with Earl's collection, and they have a little Frankenstein laboratory object theater, and they tell stories about Frankenstein and about Mary Shelley, and a wonderful new exhibition, by the way, called Mary and Her Monster. But the general point being that Earl Bakken tells the story about being a young boy of about 7 or 9 years old when the 1931 Universal Studios film of Frankenstein came out, and he saw it in the theater, and he became, from that moment, fascinated with the connection between electricity and life. And that was, for him, an inspiration to do, better than Victor Frankenstein, well, actually, it's Henry Frankenstein in the film, to do better than Frankenstein did, to inquire about the connections between electricity and life, and to build something that perhaps is the single most Frankensteinian invention that we have, is the pacemaker. So, back to a little narrative now about how one might think of motivating this myth contemporarily, as well as a couple of other things. So, let's see, I have to do it this way. So not that I need the text to say this, but this is my son Sam, about 2 or 3 years ago. But several years before that, Sam was stomping through the street-side puddles of an Arizona spring. With 350 days of sunshine and less than 8 inches of rainfall every year, I indulge him in his splashing. In an impish mood myself, I admonished him, "Watch out for the puddle gators." Not quite 3.5 at the time, he looked up with a slightly startled face, paused, and then replied, "Daddy, there's no such thing as puddle gators." "Wouldn't it be cool if there were?" "Yes!" He added a boot stomp in the puddle for emphasis. So Sam and I continued to speculate about the natural history of puddle gators. We agreed that they should be vicious predators, while I envisioned them as salamanders with a bad attitude, about the size to clamp onto your finger if it probed too close to their seasonal puddle homes. He saw them as microscopic, perhaps a little bit like the water bears that he had read about in a book of poems about pond life. I imagined the puddle gator for Sam, knowing that it would entertain him. I also imagined it knowing that there's a deep divide between my imagination and the ability of anyone, and certainly me, to literally conceive of such a wee beastie. But I have deep ambivalences about the research agenda of synthetic biology, a contemporary field of research that could eventually make puddle gators a reality. Synthetic biology sees biology in explicitly engineering terms. It sees biological parts, proteins, the metabolic pathways and systems that produce them, and the genes that encode for them. as building blocks that are interchangeable among organisms. Just as one might build a bridge from information about what bridges look and perform like, and from the materials at hand, synthetic biologists aspire to build organisms from the information contained in DNA sequences and the materials at hand from other organisms. Plug some salamander traits, like size and coloring, into the appropriate chassis of a clonable amphibian, add some alligator teeth, and poof, the puddle gator. Whether microscopic or macroscopic, puddle gators could only be playthings or ecological intrusions. Creating a male Aegyptus mosquito, however, with genes that would produce only unviable offspring, could save untold thousands of lives lost to dengue fever. More fundamentally, doing stuff because it's cool in a carefully controlled environment with plenty of contextual instruction can help encourage creativity and build the capacities to address such larger problems as disease, even if the specific activity does not do so. But fostering creativity should not foster hubris. Curiosity is not a reason for endangering others or the environment. That name Frankenstein, however, has come to represent curiosity taken to the level of hubris. Rightly, I think, because Victor had little else in mind than the grandiose goal of creating anew a more perfect being. Once he failed to create something beautiful, as well as swift and smart and strong, Victor shrank away from all responsibility toward his creation. So this is actually a still from that 1910 Edison film. Victor shrank away from all responsibility toward his creation, and the creature was left to fend for itself, learn for itself about the kindness and cruelty of humans, and ultimately confront Victor with the fatal consequences of his moral failure as creator and as father. Victor, I want to argue, has a lot in common with contemporary synthetic biologists. He understood life to be composed of interchangeable parts, and that one could create life by bringing together non-living parts with the right skill and a little jolt of something. For Victor, it was electricity. For contemporary synthetic biologists, it's the information encoded in DNA. Among the agendas of synthetic biology, beyond the Terminator mosquito, whose humanitarian purpose I find quite compelling, is a project on the so-called de-extinction of some species of animals. So in Australia recently, scientists nearly succeeded in de-extincting the gastric brooding frog. And the last time I showed this, there were some looks of revulsion in the audience about this daddy frog spitting up his little baby that he had been gestating in his stomach. This Lazarus project has set its sights on de-extincting the Tasmanian tiger. Other scientists are after the woolly mammoth, and just beyond the centennial of its disappearance, the passenger pigeon, whom some believe may have been the most numerous vertebrate ever to populate the planet, only to be driven to extinction through hunting and habitat loss. Now, de-extincting these creatures might provide some measure of dispensation for the human role in their original extinctions. But the motivations are, of course, mixed. Science writer Carl Zimmer, writing a year ago for the National Geographic, explores some of the practical and ethical consequences of de-extinction, and then closes his piece by quoting the Stanford University bioethicist Hank Greeley. For Greeley, as for many others, Zimmer writes, the very fact that science has advanced to the point that such a spectacular feat is possible is a compelling reason to embrace de-extinction, not to shun it. What intrigues me is just that it's really cool, Greeley says. A saber-toothed cat. It would be really neat to see one of those. Some scientists, however, have even floated the idea of de-extincting Neanderthal. So if you recall, a few years ago, I think it was the summer of 2015, There was a large discussion in the magazine Der Spiegel that was triggered around an interview that the synthetic biologist George Church had done for them. Now, I don't, and what George had done was talked about the possibility and rationales for de-extincting Neanderthal, but what really made press was his statement that what was needed in order to do this was, quote, an adventurous human female, unquote, to gestate the Neanderthal. Now, I don't want to discourage synthetic biologists or other scientists from discussing things in public venues that are not yet possible to do in the laboratory. In fact, I think it's vital that scientists do such things. But what could be a more Frankensteinian project than birthing into the world a unique being, a person with no prospect of biological kinship and little hope of human sympathy? Now, I want to explore my gripe with resurrecting Neanderthal with a religious tale, but not one that has much to do with transgressions against or responsibilities to God. This is a Jewish tale, and a prominent element of the Jewish tradition is that humans are co-creators with God. And in the Jewish myth of the Golem, which predates Frankenstein by several centuries, and with which one must speculate that someone as learned as Mary Shelley must have been familiar. In this myth, a man makes an animated creature from inanimate stuff, closer to the original creation because the stuff is clay, say, from a riverbank, and the spark is the name of God. In most versions of the story, the man is the Rabbi Low, the Rabbi Judah Low, a historical figure who presided at the Stara Nova or New Old Synagogue in Prague and is buried there. In most versions of the story, the Rabbi Low makes the golem only as a last resort, to protect the Jews of Prague from a pogrom, from an organized riot that everyone knows is coming, but that everyone, even the king who makes use of Judah and the community's money and Judah's wisdom, refuses to stop. The golem, exceptionally strong and obedient, defends the Jewish community, fulfilling his original purpose, saving the community from slaughter. In some versions of the story, the golem then becomes a servant in the synagogue and in the Rabbi Low's house. And the harried but also haughty rabbi neglects his paternal duties in educating the golem, at least until it seems that the monster has fallen in love with the rabbi's daughter. This is a still from the 1921 German silent film Der Golem. At this point, the rabbi takes advantage of a part of the mystery of the golem's creation, the Hebrew word emet, for truth, written across the golem's forehead. The rabbi erases the first letter aleph, leaving the Hebrew word met, or death, and the golem dies. It is a sad and even cruel moment when Rabbi Low erases the life of the golem, because it is his own human flaws and not the golem's that have precipitated the seemingly untenable situation. Compared to Victor Frankenstein, I think the Rabbi Low has done a bit better, but not an altogether satisfactory job. Rabbi Low has a precise, community-regarding, and justice-seeking reason for engaging in this extreme act of creation, something I think that Victor lacks. And while the rabbi shares Victor's culpability in failing to fulfill his paternal obligations properly, he at least retains control over a kill switch, something that Victor never had. Remember that Victor was designing a superior creature, one that was meant in some senses to be immortal. And so, like the Aegyptus mosquito, contemporary biologists have a precise community-regarding and justice-serving purpose in mind. And they have, in the Terminator gene, created a kill switch, which one hopes might work should they release this new creature into our world. But for the scientists involved in the de-extinction work, I worry that the purpose might be more self-regarding than community-regarding, more general than precise. And of course, its purpose is utterly antithetical to the purpose of the kill switch. This is Frankenweenie. So perhaps the place where we 21st century innovators might learn to be responsible is, ironically, from a child. In Tim Burton's Frankenweenie, young Victor Frankenstein discovers the secrets of revivification and applies them to his beloved dog, Sparky. The secret gets out, and the other children go about reviving their dead pets, which proceed to run amok in the traditional trope of the monster movie. But Victor has been a good and loving master to Sparky, who remains loving and loyal back. Perhaps Victor and Sparky can teach us how to love our monsters, so we don't need, as the Rabbi Lowe does, to put them out of our misery. In light of Sam's childhood love of the natural world, I often lament that natural historian or natural philosopher is not a career open to him. As in the Puddlegator story, however, I also love the way he melds his imagination with the natural world, something that natural historians, and especially, say, those turned into field biologists, are not often encouraged to do. Synthetic biologists, however, seem to partake of this melding of imagination and observation. And that is likely a career that will be open to him. So I also lament the continued short-sightedness of an innovation system that does not emphasize responsibility. For now, while Sam is still learning the rules of social behavior, along with the names of the real creatures in Arizona, such fantasy is cool. Responsibility in this broader sense comes later. But for the day he splices his first gene, I hope that he will have already learned that "wouldn't it be cool if" is not sufficient justification. What would be really cool is if he learned that from his science teacher and his art teacher and a whole host of others, and not just from me. Thank you.